Let's go take a look at some of the questioning that took place with Bill Barr. Let's start with Pramila Jayapal. She is curious as to why Bill Barr was so in touch with what was going on in Portland, but not so concerned about what was going on in other states over the past 4 or 5 months.
On 2 separate occasions, after President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan Capitol carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No.
You're not aware of that?
I was not aware of it.
Major protests in Michigan. You're the attorney general, and you didn't know that the protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded. So obviously you couldn't be concerned about that.
Well, there are a lot of protests around the United States, and on June 1st, I was worried about the District of Columbia, which is federal.
In parts of the country, you're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas and Confederate flags. Excuse me, Mr. Barr, this is my time, and I control it. You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor of Michigan to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in to do to the president's supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the attorney general, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president.
Now, the bottom line is, and some people have parsed this out and said, in Michigan, we're talking about the State House. And he tried to make that argument that I was worried about Washington, D.C. because that's federal. But we do know that these federal policemen or whatever they were picking people up on the streets of Portland. They weren't just staying at the courthouse. We do know that there have been plans drawn up to deploy these federal cops to other cities in the country, Detroit, Chicago, New York. Now, to my knowledge, there's been no, assaults on federal buildings there. So that distinction, I think, is convenient, but I don't think it's terribly accurate. And, everything we're seeing from these hearings, to a certain extent, is geared, I think, towards essentially the election, obviously. And I would have liked to have seen some actually legitimate oversight. But Barr's pretty slippery, and a lot of them don't have the ability to do it. But at least in terms of getting an effective message out there as to that Bill Barr is a compromised attorney general, I think that's effective. Here's Ted Lieu testifying to the House Judiciary Committee that, or I should say, questioning Bill Barr during his testimony and explaining to Bill Barr why unmarked van arrests are unconstitutional.
This is not a trick question, Mr. Barr. I'm just citing you what the Supreme Court said. So here's a problem. under this standard black letter law, which has been in effect for over 40 years, what the federal forces in Portland did was unconstitutional. Federal forces in full combat gear in the dark of night grabbed a protester who was peacefully standing there, forced him into an unmarked van, drove him to a separate location, searched him, detained him, and questioned him. That is what police states do. That's what authoritarian regimes do.
But I don't think those were the facts.
That's not. I haven't asked you a question yet, Mr. Barr. Okay. What the federal officials did was illegal because they didn't have probable cause. And how do we know that? Because Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Service, Chris Klein, admitted it on national TV. Deputy Director Klein said that the individual that they were questioning was in a crowd and in an area where another individual was aiming a laser at the eyes of officers. That's guilt by association. That's what the Fourth Amendment prohibits. Deputy Director Klein further stated that the protester was released after federal officials concluded, quote, they did not have what they needed, unquote, which again shows there's no probable cause. And it appears that federal Deputy Director Klein appears to understand that there was no probable cause because he essentially justifies that action as saying it wasn't an arrest. He calls it, quote, a simple engagement, unquote. I'm a former prosecutor. I've never heard that term, a simple engagement, because it's a made-up excuse. What these federal officials did was an arrest. They grabbed a peaceful protester, they forced him into a van, drove him to another location, questioned him. That is exactly what the Supreme Court prohibited over 40 years ago.
Bill Barr's not even listening. But it's important that these markers are put down. And I think, like I say, we just heard, and I'm not convinced, frankly, that it's not a function of this hearing. The governor of Oregon, do you have that, Brendan? Can you put that up? The announcement that the governor of Oregon announced, I don't know, 45 minutes ago, that federal officers will be retreating, I guess, from Portland. And I'm not convinced that it wasn't a function of that hearing. It put some pressure. Here's Kate Brown. After my discussions with Vice President Pence and others, the federal government has agreed to withdraw federal officers from Portland. They have acted as an occupying force and brought violence. Starting tomorrow, all Customs and Border Protection and ICE officers will leave downtown Portland. And then she goes on to say, our local Oregon State police officers will be downtown to protect Oregonians' right to free speech and keep the peace. Sent to the Black Lives Matter movement's demands for racial justice and police accountability. It's time for bold action to reform police practices. So there it is. All right, let's play